Hi, this is Marshall again. I have another little snippet for you. This is on the Book of Mormon. So we're going to look at the Book of Mormon. Across from the table of contents on most of your Book of Mormons from 1981 and newer, there is a page called A Brief Explanation about the Book of Mormon. And at the bottom of the page, 1981 and newer, it says this: about this edition, some minor errors in the text have been perpetuated in past editions of the Book of Mormon. This edition contains corrections that seem appropriate to bring the material into conformity with pre-publication manuscripts and early editions edited by the prophet Joseph Smith. Okay, so what do we do with that? Well, in the Mormons, they look at that and they go, well, okay, there were some problems, but they were pretty minor and they got them fixed. Everything's fine. That's pretty much what they got. The problem is this tells us a whole lot more. Now, when we talk about authentication, this didn't get in there because Marshall snuck it in there. It didn't get in there because the Baptist Church snuck it in there. It didn't get in there because the Muslims snuck it in there, or the Catholics, or anybody else. The true church, the Mormon Church, with the true prophets and true apostles, put this in there. They're explaining why the 1981 version is newer. Now, when you think about the Book of Mormon, you think about the modern version. But we have previous versions of the Book of Mormon, okay? We're going to talk about that as we get through this paragraph. So, firstly, it says it's the first time inside of the leather scriptures, or maybe hardback scriptures, whichever you have, first time inside the bindings of LDS scripture where the prophets and apostles are admitting their minor errors in the text. Now, that's kind of significant in my opinion. It's the bottom of the page, but it's still significant. So it says, some minor errors in the text have been perpetuated in past editions of the Book of Mormon. Now, if the Mormon Church admitted major errors, thinking people would get out. You'd have an avalanche of people getting out of the Mormon Church. Holy cow, we're in the wrong church. But you say minor errors. You didn't hear of an avalanche of people getting out in 1981 or 82 when they read this. It's like, oh, yeah, we got some problems. We got them fixed. Everything's fine. Some minor errors in the text. That's the worst the Mormon Church could ever admit and not have an avalanche of people getting out. So that makes it a little more, when you think about that, it makes it a little more significant. Some minor errors in the text have been perpetuated in past editions of the Book of Mormon. Now, what are the past editions? They're not telling you what the past editions are. Well, when you look, you have the 1830 first edition. You have the 1837, the most rare, second edition. You have the 1840, and you have the 1842. Those are the early editions that the prophet was edited, okay? Because he died in 1844. So you got it. Those are the four official editions. Now there's other publications of those editions in England that have different dates on them, but it's a copy of the 1837 or the 1830 or whatever. But and so it has maybe 1843 on it, but it's really not an 1843 like its original edition. These are the four original editions, and they take these editions, they take them down the printer, say, make me one of these, and they put the modern date on it. But it's still one of those. So those are the four early editions edited by the prophet Joseph Smith. So some minor errors in the text have been perpetuated in past editions of the Book of Mormon. Well, who's the perpetrator of these perpetuations? That's the question you need to ask there. Who perpetrated it? Was it the Baptist Church, the Muslims, the Jehovah's Witnesses? Who perpetuated these minor errors? Well, it's the true God with the true prophet with the true church that made these true errors. That's what the answer is. And, they may not like that answer, but that's basically what they're saying is our true church perpetuated minor errors in the past. Okay? So this edition contains corrections. Well, okay. So where did the minor errors come from? We have to think about that in your Book of Mormon. I hold my Book of Mormon up and I talk to Mormons and I say, now, if this is a Book of Mormon, we got minor errors in here. Where did they come from? We got three sources: God, man, or the devil. So let's assume God doesn't make any errors. I mean, maybe he does in your book, but he doesn't in mine. So let's assume he's a perfect God, doesn't make errors. So then you got two left, the man or the devil. So let's just assume the best. That these errors were not the devil working with Joseph Smith. This was work of man somehow got in there. Okay, so minor errors are in there. Now, we want to take those minor errors out, and that's what they say. This edition contains corrections. That means they're putting something else back in. So the question again is, where do these corrections come from? Well, you have three choices. Same three choices, by the way. They can come from God, they can come from man, or the devil. Now, we would hope they come from God, but that's not what they're telling us. Really, Marshall? Well, let's just go ahead and read the rest of it. This edition contains corrections that seem appropriate to bring the material into conformity. Now, who does conformity? Does holy God conform to sinful man, or does sinful man try to conform to a holy God? Yeah, right. The work of conformity is man. God doesn't conform to anybody. He's thus saith the Lord. He speaks, it's done, forget it. You don't conform nothing. This is the way it is. Man, he is not really too sure, makes a lot of mistakes, needs to conform to the truth because he makes errors. This edition contains corrections that seem appropriate to bring the material into conformity with pre-publication manuscripts. There are two, they're not telling you that, and early editions edited by the prophet Joseph Smith, and I told you there's 4. Okay, the 2 manuscripts that are pre-publication, that means they're still handwriting. They haven't published it in print, right? Pre-publication manuscripts, you have the original manuscript that Joseph Smith got by revelation, and then you have the printer manuscript, which is a copy. And we've already talked about errors in copying. We have the original manuscript, if we did, of the book of Ephesians by Paul. We could copy it over and over again, and if we're really careful, we'd get a perfect copy. But when we translate it, then that's when we have different versions, because words don't mean exactly the same when you translate them. So you have to try and get the best meaning you can based on the context and the whole thing. So translations are more difficult than copying. I mean, a second grader can copy the alphabet perfectly if he tries hard enough. Okay? So you can be a good copyist, but translation now, that's a different story. So this edition contains corrections that seem appropriate to bring the material into conformity. That means work of man. With pre-publication manuscripts, there's 2. So you've got the original and the copy is not quite exactly as the original. There's going to be little things going on, nothing major. And then, and in conformity with pre-publication manuscripts and early editions edited by the prophet Joseph Smith. They weren't edited by God. They're edited by the prophet Joseph Smith. Okay, so he's the man that's speaking for God. He's doing the editing. He's doing the writing of the scriptures. So he's supposed to be the one inspired. So he's editing them. So he didn't get it right the first time like Paul did, or John, or anybody else. Or Moses. He has to edit them to get them right. So God wasn't doing a really good job according to that, because he didn't get it right the first time. He also said the Book of Mormon was the most correct book on earth, and a person could get nearer to God by abiding its precepts than by any other book. Well, I don't want to get nearer to God. I want to get there. It's like, if I'm trying to get to Hawaii, getting near to Hawaii is not really a good deal. I want to get all the way, okay? So that's really not a good deal. It sounds good when you're thinking about it, but I don't really want to get near to Hawaii. I want to get there all the way. I don't want to go in the water and, suck water. I don't want to do that. So this edition contains corrections that seem appropriate to bring the material into conformity with pre-publication manuscripts and early editions edited by the prophet Joseph Smith. So he's putting corrections in there. He took out the work of man. He's putting back in the work of man. That's what they're saying. This edition contains corrections that seem appropriate. Now, I've been telling you about this a certain way. I've been reading it a certain way. Now, if I read it a little differently, you'll get the idea. This edition contains corrections that seem appropriate. I've heard of thus saith the Lord. I've never heard of a thus saith the Lord. Here we have a thus saith the Lord. If this came from God, he doesn't know for sure. And that's what we have here on the beginning of the Book of Mormon. That's how it starts. Right there on the brief explanation of the Book of Mormon, the Mormon Church is explaining to you and to me how the Book of Mormon came to be and how Joseph Smith was a good editor and how he's fixing it up. It's a fixer-up edition. So in my book, I wouldn't have any problem with the Book of Mormon as long as it started this way. Once upon a time in a land far, far away.